basically, I think that there are four questions that emerged in my mind watching and talking about, writing about events over the past weeks. The first is, what was the Organization of American States, its Secretary General, member governments doing in the weeks and before the crisis began, before the military ousted President Zelaya? Was the OAS, in effect, doing enough to try and manage the crisis? Second, was the Organization of American States and its member governments right in taking a very strong initial position, right in the aftermath of the coup, of the sending Zelaya out of the country? Should it, instead of taking the harsh measures with ultimatums and threats, try to move very quickly toward a negotiating position and to try and resolve this not through ultimatums and threats, but rather through some form of negotiations that somewhere along the line, I'll let the Secretary General sort of interpret that. Hello?
You said you were going to be brief.
There it is. The third question is, what next in negotiations? Does Zelaya go back? Does he not go back? What is the outcome? What is the alternatives? And what are the implications of the different alternatives? And finally, what does all this mean for the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the sort of whole idea of collective defense of democracy in the hemisphere, and what does it mean for the Secretary General? Mr. Secretary General.
I must, as I said, I must admit I haven't been able to prepare very much. So your questions were very helpful, were very pertinent, and I will try to answer them all. Not necessarily in the same order, but I will answer. I will follow the questions one by one and try to answer them. But I would like to say something first, if you don't mind. And it's that when we say, and we often say it, I say it very much, that democracy has flourished in the Americas in the past 20 years as never before, we're only really saying part of the truth. Indeed, there have never been more democratically elected governments, elected in free and fair elections with strong participation and respect for basic freedoms. This is no minor achievement, but it cannot hide that these democracies in origin are still, and in several cases, very imperfect in exercise. In the last decade, we have had governments that ended before time. Recently, they have become more stable, but there is a trend to change the rules of the game to ensure that leaders are re-elected. And constitutional change, which is in healthy democracies should be a moment of national consensus, has instead originated serious confrontations in some countries of the region. All this is true. There are several limitations still remaining in the development of democratic regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we have to work daily to correct them and improve them. But whatever the imperfections of democracy, and whatever our inabilities to deal with them, a military coup, a coup d'etat, is a different thing. A coup is a rape of democracy. The overthrow of governments by force is a setback, not only of the country that suffers it and has to watch armed forces do away with democratic rule, it is a setback for a whole region, which cannot be allowed to happen. The rape of democracy is something that happened very often until a few decades ago in the region, and still seems shameful to remember. Many of us still recall the tanks of the streets, the shooting, the president thrown into exile, the violations of human rights. and above all, the sensation of loss and impotence that follows the imposition of force over reason. Allow me a personal note on this, which I have shared with some of you in the past 2 weeks. I was only a child in 1954, but I still have memories of the coup in Guatemala against constitutional president Jacobo Arbenz. And strangely, I don't have memories of other coups, but of this one I do have one, and for a very personal reason, which I'll recall very vividly. I was in bed with flu. I was 10, 11 years old, and I was reading some issues of Life magazine, which had a Spanish edition, as always, as we all remember, had very good photographs, especially. And the full-page photo called my attention. I still remember it today. It was a picture of the deposed President Jacobo Arbenz forced to take off his clothes in an airport before going into exile. To make things better, he was taking off his pants in the photograph. As all rapes, coups not only serve to depose people, but also to humiliate them in an attempt to deprive them of their dignity. And many of us, including some of the present leaders of the Americas, have personal memories of this. And are very much decided that they are never going to let it happen again. As it also happens with rapes, there is always someone with impeccable democratic credentials and full of goodwill who is willing to say that maybe the victim brought it upon his or herself, or him or herself. Yes, she was raped, but then what was she doing there? Why was she dressed that way? Yes, he was pushed out of bed and thrown out of office and from his country at gunpoint. But he was trying to change the Constitution in a dubious way. I want to be very clear from the outset, and I think that I answered one of the questions in this point. And I think I represent every member country of the OAS when I say this. If you want to have democratic rule in the region, if you want people to believe in your democratic institutions, if you want to improve the quality of democracy, if you want to correct all its defects, don't try to justify the rape of democracy. You don't rape democracy to save it. So when a coup occurs, the first thing you have to do is to denounce it as a very serious crime, and not start by legitimizing the offenders as participants of any kind of dialogue. And this is exactly what we did. In the Permanent Council of the OAS on the same day of the coup, and later in our General Assembly that started in June the 30th and reconvened on the 4th of July, we condemned the coup without any qualifications, with the agreement of all member states. We moved swiftly to make sure that nobody would recognize them, and we were completely successful in that. The result of this swift action was that no government in the whole world has recognized the de facto dictatorship of Roberto Micheletti. By the way, we are not the first to do it. The European Union, for reasons of ours, did it before we did. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, in our morning that day, the European Union met a meeting in Corfu, Greece, made a very strong statement condemning the coup, and condemned it explicitly. They are not just calling for the restoration of democracy, not calling for any kind of discussions. And after that, after this was clearly established, then it was possible to start a diplomatic effort to return to democracy in Honduras. And that is why, on the morning of the 6th of July, Monday, I called from El Salvador President Oscar Arias to ask him if he was willing to undertake this effort. He said that he would be willing if the OAS agreed and supported him, if President Zelaya agreed, and if the de facto government was willing to participate. I told him I was calling him precisely to give him our support, and later that day, Micheletti agreed, and on Tuesday, President Zelaya communicated his agreement in the meeting with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I do not resent, however, those who have said that Arias was an alternative to the OAS. Probably they are misinformed. I want to solve the problem of Honduras, not to take credit for it. And as somebody very intelligently said, there are two kinds of actions. One is to do something, the other one is to take credit. Maybe you should do the first one because you have less competition in that. Therefore, President Arias is not an alternative to the OAS. On the contrary, his role was made possible by the strong action that the OAS took in the previous days. If the de facto government had seen a divided international community and had been recognized by some governments, or had obtained a delay of sanctions, or if we had been willing to negotiate before any punitive action, we would have today a stronger dictatorship. Not one who's saying that he's willing to resign if the other one doesn't come back, which is already an improvement, I must admit. President Arias' dialogues are the logical sequence of what the OAS did and would not have been possible if we had failed to do it. And we will continue doing it. Despite of all kinds of criticism and comments, we are going to continue until the president, the elected president of Honduras, the constitutional president of Honduras, returns to his office. Then there will be elections and there will be several other things. The crazy thing about this coup is that it happened 5 months before the election. And it was being, by the way, what President Arias wanted was to put a fourth box in the election, in the same election where his successor was being elected. I mean, therefore, he couldn't. I mean, there was absolutely no possibility that he could run for re-election. His successor was being elected in the same moment in which he was asking for a vote on the constitutional reform. But we can discuss that. But I mean, any solution necessarily, and we can talk about that, has to go past through this, because as I told somebody, I mean, when you meet with the presidents of South America, for example, they don't really know about the fourth box or the artículos pétreos, which is something like articles cast in stone or something like that. They can care about how many times, if the president gets reelected or doesn't get reelected, if there's a conflict between the president and the Congress, etc. All they want is the president restored. That is what is unacceptable. That is a rape of democracy and has to be corrected. Now I will go into some of the matters Peter raised before me. Yes, we knew that tensions were really rising in Honduras in the weeks prior to the ouster of President Zelaya. And there were signs. There were so many signs that actually I had already sent twice Ambassador Raúl Alconada to Honduras to talk to the president and to other authorities on the conflict that was brewing with the consulta that President Zelaya wanted to call. He did go at the beginning of the week prior to the coup, and at the same time we received a letter from the foreign minister asking the OAS to observe this consultation that was going to be held. Contrary to what has been said, we said no. We didn't say yes. And we were not going to send an observation mission of the OAS in according to the Democratic Charter, because that was not an election. It was not an election and it was not a referendum. If President Zelaya said that it was a non-mandatory consultation, we have no authority to observe those things, and we don't do that. And I told you just, because he is the president of Honduras, that I will send 2 or 3 persons on that Sunday to observe this process. When Raúl Alconada arrived a few days before, he could very easily see what the degree of conflict was. And we decided actually not to send any kind of supervising mission or anything like that. That was canceled. But Alconada did go back to Honduras when the problems were really getting heavier. The president decided, I have said that I think he made a mistake on that, to ask the military to help him in this consultation. Several Chileans, Argentinians, and others could have told you that you never call the military to do that kind of thing. But he did call the military, and the head of the armed forces said that he wouldn't do it because there was a decision from a judge that this was illegal. The president asked for his resignation. The head of the military went to the Supreme Court that gave him a stay of this, because like something like an habeas corpus. And the president did not, I repeat, sign a decree firing the head of the armed forces. Actually, he, in fact, in light of the decision of the Supreme Court, he did not sign the decree to send away the commander-in-chief. However, we saw that this was a difficult problem. So I came back to Washington. I was in Mexico at that moment, and we called our council and decided to send a mission to Honduras on Monday, as soon as possible, because we saw that there was a conflict between the government and the Parliament and the Supreme Court that could develop into something dangerous. And we appointed a mission, headed by the Secretary General, and including 4 or 5 ambassadors, members of our council. That mission was supposed to go as soon as possible. Let me tell you that and I think some of the ambassadors present were informed of this. I mean, President Zelaya thought that the conflict was brewing, that he needed very much the presence of the OAS, but he was not in that much of a hurry. I told him that we would go on Monday, and he said that's true, that he had to go to the meeting of the CICA, of the Inter-American Integration System, the Central American Integration System, which was on Monday. And then he was going to the inauguration of President Martinelli in Panama. So maybe we could go Thursday or Friday. I called him back on Saturday, and I told him that I thought that it was indispensable to go immediately. Unfortunately, I had the text of the resolution that said to send an urgent mission to Honduras. I said, President, I have a resolution that says this is urgent. And we agreed that we would go on Monday. We should have flown on Monday to Honduras to have meetings with all the different sectors and try to sort out the situation. We were very concerned about the situation. So my answer to this was yes. We did make an effort, and we were flying to Honduras early Monday morning to start working there. We were going to work Monday and Tuesday, and then I would go also to the inauguration of President Martinelli. And so the answer is yes, we were involved in efforts to discourage any movements towards any kind of action. Unfortunately, on the morning of Sunday morning, the coup occurred. And it was very surprising for everybody. I can assure you that we called several people in Tegucigalpa. Nobody knew what was going on. Actually, when we knew what was going on, was when I could ascertain what was going on, was about an hour and a half later, when already told that the president had been kidnapped and they taken someplace at gunpoint and all that. I received a call from President Oscar Arias. And he told me, I have President Zelaya standing on the runway of the airport of San Jose, and he said that They just dropped him there, and they never. So I wanted to tell you that I'm sending my people to take him to a hotel. I will see him later, but I wanted to report to you on this matter. Then we had the meetings, which we already know, but I would like to go on in order here. Some things I've said that are not true. Shouldn't the OES and member governments have discouraged the attempt flight to Tegucigalpa? Yes, they did, and so did I. They did during the assembly, as you may remember here. Several governments said that they thought that probably wasn't a good idea for the president to attempt to return to Tegucigalpa. On the next day, we met with him. You must remember that there were three presidents that had come to the assembly for the first time. We had never had three presidents at the assembly to accompany President Zelaya on his return to Honduras. And I went to that meeting in the morning to say that I could not go because I thought that several members of the council felt that they had objections for that. Not objections in political terms, in terms of safety and of convenience of doing it precisely on that day and with all the conditions. During the morning, it became very clear that conditions did not exist. The Argentinian head of state, staff was notified that the permission to fly over Honduras had been canceled, had been withdrawn. We will learn that the airport had been closed, and that that the runway was even blocked. So it was very clear that they couldn't go. Someone suggested that we should start flying to Honduras anyway, and then go to some other place. And I said, I can't do that either. I cannot go to Honduras because I don't have the agreement of the Council of the OAS to go to Honduras. The presidents were in a very difficult situation, of course, and I thought it was my duty, and I did it, to tell them that why not going, the four of us, to El Salvador and wait there for things to develop. Because President Zelaya had very clearly stated that he was going to try to make it to Honduras anyway. We cannot stop him from doing that, but the presidents and myself decided instead to go to El Salvador. That was a choice. Probably discussed 2 days before, there would have been other choices. At that moment, it was very simple. It was very simple, and I took that decision because I thought that it was my duty to protect the three presidents that had come for this occasion, and that I felt could not go and in no way try to land in Tegucigalpa, and I offered them to accompany them to El Salvador. I don't think that was a mistake, but I'm sorry. So I didn't join the presidents traveling in El Salvador. It's even worse. I told them that I invited them to go with me to El Salvador. It was the option that I had at that moment, and I used that option. Now, as I said before, I asked President Arias to lead this negotiation. I thought that it was the best choice if we really wanted this to happen. We supported him. We have a person working with him. By chance, the same person that worked with President Arias in the peace plan of the 80s, John Beale, is now a representative in Uruguay and the Mercosur. And so we took about 10 seconds with President Arias on agreeing who was going to accompany him in this mission. What are the prospects of the negotiations to succeed? I would say that this goes up and down, and at this moment it's up. But let me say that when I speak to President Arias every day. When I spoke to him on the day of the negotiations, at the night of the negotiations, he was convinced that this was not going to work. And the next day, Monday, I don't remember the dates exactly, the day in the morning, I mean, things did pick up at least to be able to say that eventually there would be a new round of negotiations sometime in the next few weeks. But we have different indications that things may go forward, and we think that I would say we're cautiously optimistic for the meeting of Saturday. I have said that I think that some good results will be achieved. I'm not saying that the negotiation will be concluded at that moment, because this has a lot of specific points that will probably want to be discussed. So what are the points? What are the issues to be discussed? I don't know exactly what all of them are. I know of one of them, but that one will certainly have some other additions. The one is the return of the President Zelaya. This will not work if it doesn't include the return of President Zelaya. Nobody would imagine that. I mean, everybody in the world. When I went to Honduras, they told me that the two governments in the world, and one was Taiwan, you know, Honduras has relations with Taiwan, that were recognizing the government, and immediately later I read the statement from the president of Taiwan saying that he supported President Zelaya. So there's nobody in the world who would understand that having this general consensus, the president would not return to his post. But then there has been a coup, and things have to be repaired. And they have to be repaired, creating some degree of national unity that will let the country go forward. So issues such as precisely national unity, will that be reflected in the government? That is a possibility, it has been suggested. What's going to happen with the constitutional reform? President Zelaya has said that he will not insist on that. There's no time for that, and that will be left for the next government. So maybe somebody will want to register that in writing. What about the amnesty? Are going to be amnesties in this court? Crimes are going to be covered by the amnesties. The elections. Some people have spoken about moving the election forward. I don't think there's much at this time, much insistence in that, but it may appear also. What President Arias wants is to reach some kind of a blueprint. But after the blueprint, you have to write down all the things that are going to happen, and that will take time. But the first thing is to find out if there's some room for agreement in there. I was glad to hear that Mr. Miguel is saying that he's willing to step down, but of course I don't think he has he cannot really have any hope of bringing President Zelaya down with him. I think that would be a mistake, and he'll have to think about that again. But there are other things that have to be elected. I mean, to decide. You have to guarantee the other institutions of the Honduran state. President Zelaya said also that he's very willing to say very clear that he's not going to touch the Congress or the Supreme Court or the electoral powers. You have to decide what you're going to do with the military that actually gave the coup. They gave the orders for the coup. So there are several things that we have to deal with before. Of course, if the election take place in November, we're going to observe it. But if the elections take place normally, after the situation has been, we cannot. We have to send electoral missions according to the democratic charter. And the democratic charter has worked in this time. I'm going to say that later. So when democracy is restored, of course, we're willing to send a mission, and to send it as of now, immediately, not only in November, but to be there for 2 or 3 months to make sure that all the process takes place in a reasonable way. Now, of the last questions, I would say first that I think that the democratic charter that has been really used for the first time, because I must admit, this is an old discussion at the OAS, when there was the coup against President Chavez in 2002, the president was deposed, the president was taken out of the palace, the president was returned to the palace, the president was returned to power, and the OAS was still discussing if they should apply the democratic charter or not. So it didn't have. They did apply it later. I mean, they made a statement on that later. This is the first time it works, and it worked. And I think that's very proper. That's very important. I think that if I had given a conference of the democratic charter 2 months ago, I would have said that we are having some problems. That people are less. I mean, and other issues are being discussed, and not the democratic charter. Today, the democratic charter is very much at the center. And I think that it's time, therefore, to discuss its contents and its limitations, because it does have severe limitations. If you go into the OES webpage, you will find a report I made before Council about over 2 years ago, in which I stated very clearly, from my point of view, what were the boundaries, the reach of the democratic charter, and what are the limitations. The first limitation is, of course, one that could be said is inherent to the institution. The OAS is an institution, an organization of American states. As all international organizations, states are represented by governments. Therefore, governments, executive branches, have a good access to the OAS for the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Other actors of society do not have that. When Lucio Gutierrez dissolved the Supreme Court of Ecuador, and I don't want to go back into that, that's an old story, but he did. The court would very much like to protest before somebody, but there was nobody. The Supreme Court of Ecuador could not resort to the Inter-American Democratic Charter unless the Secretary General asked for permission from the government to go to Ecuador, which of course would have been denied, or some other member of council took over the matter and presented it before some other country. So one thing I said was that we had a problem of access to the charter, and the other problem we do have, of course, is that especially in these parts, in these matters, the charter speaks about serious, que afecte gravemente alteraciones del orden constitucional, alterations of the constitutional regime that seriously affect democratic order. Now, what does seriously affect democratic order means? This is a charter that talks about corruption, talks about human rights, talks about the rights of women, talks about several things. Has a very broad definition of democracy. When can we say that the constitutional order has been seriously or gravely altered? And I proposed there to have some definition. Actually, it was not my proposal. President Jimmy Carter had proposed it in a conference at the OAS before I became Secretary General. His proposal came from a book by Robert Dahl called Polyarchy, and he proposes several issues that could be considered as violations as serious violations. The violation of the integrity of central institutions, or of separation of powers, the elections that do not fulfill the minimal international conditions, the suspension of periodical elections, the lack of respect for the results of an election, the interruption of the constitutional mandate of anyone that was elected by the people, etc., etc. But we should have some. We can't do everything. We have to do some things only. So the charter is in good standing. I think this has been a big success, and probably we could or should discuss at this moment or later after the crisis is over ways to improve it. Unfortunately, yes, if this succeeds, and even not succeeding, there are a lot of temptations. You must have read in the paper. In the papers is yesterday, it was that in some country which I will not mention, the vice president he said that he was ready to take office if the president was impeached. That was not probably a coup he was suggesting, but it very much looked like like some things are beginning to happen. So I think that the possibility, the likelihood of political problems, not of military problems. The military don't, in general, want to intervene. It's basically the political actors that try to get the military and justify the intervention, but the dangers do exist. So I hope that this will not happen again. I'm sorry about the disorder, Peter, but I think I went into every question you asked me, and I'm willing to answer, to take even more from the audience if you want.